Okay, so why are we here? Collections Management Systems, or CMS as we'll refer to it throughout most of the webinar today, it's a highly complex, typically, sort of database, and depending on your familiarity with database behavior and functionality, let alone what sort of CMS options are out there for you, the topic can be intimidating and overwhelming, especially if you've never been in charge of shopping and selecting one before. So it can be highly technical, especially if you are finding yourself in the open source area of interest for your collections management system. There's a certain level of knowledge that you'll need to have in order to understand or implement those types of tools. It can be a very extensive process also, depending on your organization setting, depending on the opportunities and challenges that are present there, and any sort of budget, resource limitations or not. All of it will typically lead to it being a several months long process. And for larger agencies, sometimes you're actually looking at a year to 2 years. Especially if you're municipally funded, there is some very stringent procurement processes that you'll need to go through, which just adds time to it. So something to be aware of. It can be a very long process. It can take a substantial amount of time and energy, even if you find yourself on the shorter end of a procurement process. It still will take you and your team quite a bit of time in going through this particular sort of selection process, let alone implementing. And then there can be multiple opinions and restrictions. So the larger your team is, or perhaps the larger your organization is, the more stakeholders, understandably, that you would need to account for, the more diversity of needs and functionality there may be for your particular procurement process. So that can be there, as well as the restrictions that we spoke of in terms of maybe there is financial restrictions, maybe you have IT or security restrictions, some additional factors that can make the process more complex than it already is, and potentially costly. So it's not a particularly quick, fast, and easy process to go through. It is also not a cheap process to go through. Even if you do find yourself in the open source camp, and open source can and often does mean free, though not always, however, can be viewed as cheaper. But even if you do go the somewhat cheaper route, there is still costs, both direct and indirect, to consider. So again, regardless of whether you're on that end or going completely custom or proprietary, the process itself, regardless of the product you choose, has cost associated with it. As far as scenarios that can lead to needing a new CMS, there are a few different ways you can find yourself here. For those who have not yet and who are new to this, look out for these things because they'll be good indicators that you will be soon going through a CMS procurement process. So first, and perhaps most common, is that the CMS budget changes, whether that is increasing or decreasing. Unfortunately, usually, mostly decreasing. There's just more restrictions to the funds available, could necessitate meaning a change in the product that you are using. Another factor that could change the CMS that your museum or archives wishes to use is the staff interest or ability shifts or changes. For example, if you're going from a mostly volunteer ran collection to having professional staff or vice versa, maybe you've lost a good chunk of professional staff and you're now working with maybe volunteer staff for the time being. Having that shift in knowledge, interest, ability is all going to change the ability and interest of using your CMS product. There can also be a shift in how the technology is used. For us, in using a collections management system, we are starting to, I think, find ourselves in a new plateau of standard use and functionality, though, of course, with the advent of Gen AI and ability to incorporate that into tools, I think will probably be our next dramatic functionality shift. But as an example, that's complete shift in how technology could be used. So keeping an eye out for whether that is technology changing or museum or archives needs changing. The through line there is that there is a change in how we want to use the particular technology. Another factor could be a change in operating system requirements. This one is more unusual, but if there's some sort of increase in needing to address risk or security issues, perhaps there's a change in whether or not you can have a hosted instance or if it needs to be like directly in situ. So there can be things that shift from your organization's perspective that necessitates a change in your CMS as to whether or not it can meet those new demands or restrictions. And then finally, CMS death, outdated or merged. So throughout the last several decades, we have seen dozens of different archives and museum collections management systems and related tools that have come and gone. And that is a normal, natural process for many technology and especially software products. From our field, we're a little slower to change in terms of seeing software come in and go out. However, it does still happen, especially if you are in using open source products. If the community or whoever the major developer is or supporter is in that area, if they were ever to leave, those products will typically atrophy. Some CMS products, they'll be absorbed by a larger company and then sunsetted or developed and merged into a different type of product. So there's a lot of different ways where the current system you're using essentially, for all intents and purposes, disappears. And you, even if you stay with the product, so to speak, you will still need to migrate to whatever that new version of it is. So even if it does kind of stick around, it is still transforming, which means your use of it will also need to transform.